In my updated Tommy's Matchbook breakdown, which I released about a month ago, and I do apologize for my abrupt and prolonged hiatus, I promised I'd show you how I like to kit myself out when using Tommy's. Now, when considering a build surrounding this weapon, I think a lot of people's brains probably go straight to the Titan class. And I mean, rightfully so. There are some really nice exotic armor pieces that you could pair with Tommy's. I pretty much play Warlock exclusively at this point though, so that's not the direction I'm going with this one. And I promise it's not just Team Shoulder Pads that gets to have fun with Tommy's. Us in the bathrobe camp can be pretty darn effective with this thing as well. It just takes the right setup, which is why we're here. So without further ado, here's my setup when using Tommy's. The preferred subclass is Dawnblade. For aspect number 1, Icarus Dash. Mainly due to its enhanced utility with our exotic armor piece. More on that coming up. Aspect number 2, Touch of Flame. And this is really what provides the special sauce that makes this setup usable in more difficult content. If I was just fluffing around in the Strike playlist, things would probably look a lot different here. But my goal was to give this build a chance to reach as high as it could. So when paired with Touch of Flame, our Healing Grenade grants 2x Restoration. The standard 1x heals you at the rate of about 40 hit points per second. And that does do a nice job at keeping up with the self-damage being inflicted by using Tommy's. 2x Resto, on the other hand, gives you about 65 hit points per second. This very much supersedes the inflicted self-damage from Tommy's, and still allows you to tank a lot of incoming damage from enemy combatants. Now, you could always get that 2x Restoration through Phoenix Dive and Heat Rises, but I just find a Healing Grenade to be a bit more practical. But for me, that 2x Restoration is a non-negotiable. I gotta have it. Your melee, your jump, your rift, take whatever you're comfortable with, none of them are integral parts of the build. For the super, feel free to take Daybreak if your heart's really set on it, but I just find Well of Radiance to be much more useful in a wider scope of activities. Moving on to the fragments, and here again, I probably would have been a lot more offensive minded with these picks if I was just making a general use build, but survivability did remain my top priority. So, Ember of Empyrean. Solar weapon or ability final blows extend the duration of restoration and radiant effects applied to you. This is what's going to allow us to keep that 2x Restoration up pretty much indefinitely. As long as you're killing enemies with Tommy's, you are going to have constant healing. Next, Ember of Solace. Radiant and Restoration effects applied to you have an increased duration. Now, this doesn't increase it a ton from base, it goes from 4 seconds to 6 seconds on your resto, but in my experience, in the moment-to-moment gameplay, 2 seconds can make a big difference. Then, Ember of Searing. Defeating scorched targets grants melee energy and creates a fire sprite. With Tommy's applying Scorch to targets, that is easy access to these fire sprites, and they do award grenade energy when collected. Last up, Ember of Mercy, and this one is kind of a double-edged sword, which I'll discuss later on in the video, but when you revive a teammate, you and nearby allies gain Restoration, and picking up a fire sprite also grants Restoration. Now this is referring to your base 1x Resto, but with this fragment, fire sprites can refresh your 2x Restoration if already applied. Moving on. Our exotic armor piece, Rain of Fire, for 2 main reasons. 1, because f*** reloading Tommy's manually, I will never have time for that shit. Icarus dashing with this exotic reloads all equipped weapons, thus eliminating the reload speed pain point of Tommy's Matchbook. Reason number 2, we want access to the Radiant buff. I went hard at survivability in the subclass fragments and didn't have room for Ember of Torches. Rain of Fire is our avenue to achieving that 25% damage increase. Fusion Rifle or Linear Fusion Rifle final blows proc the Radiant damage buff. So bring along your favorite Kinetic Slot Fusion or Heavy Linear Fusion and you're covered. For our armor mods, there's only a few of any real consequence. Take Harmonic or Solar Siphon, you're gonna want to be making orbs. Not only do they fuel your super, but they will give you armor charge, and since we have 2 Solar Surge mods equipped, we'll need orbs to make use of that. That's gonna give us another 17% more damage roughly. And yes, these Surge mods do stack with Radiant. If you can squeeze 3 on comfortably, go nuts, you're gonna get a 22% damage increase. Just remember, if there's a Solar Surge active in a given activity, you're automatically getting a 25% solar damage boost, and these mods aren't gonna push it up past that. Spend those points on something else. For my stats, I prioritized Resilience and Recovery, and especially Discipline in this setup. Is 100 Discipline overkill here? Yeah, maybe. But I'd much rather have my Healing Grenade and not need it, than need my Healing Grenade and not have it. And before we hop into the general discussion of using this build, I just want to show you what kind of damage you can expect coming from Tommy's with this setup. When testing it earlier this season in the Spire of the Watcher dungeon, we saw some pretty darn respectable numbers coming from a primary weapon. When the weapon overheats after the 20th round fired, the damage jumps up by about 100%. Almost 2k per crit, about 11,000 in total scorch damage, and ignition for about 12,000 points of damage. almost 200,000 in terms of single mag damage, single mag damage per second at 24k, which is very solid for a primary weapon. I mean, Tommies can put up some numbers. 2 surge mods in the Radiant buff jumps all that up by about 46%. And since both the Scorch and the Ignition are weapon bound, they follow suit as well. Almost 300k in single mag damage now, and 35,000 in terms of single mag damage per second. That's versus a boss tier target as well. You can figure for about 33% more damage versus major tier enemies, and another 80% versus minor tier enemies, due to the shifts in damage scaling when jumping between tiers. Moral of the story, when you get both buffs rolling at the same time, Tommies can really rip through a lot of targets in short order. Now, this setup as a whole does have some really strong selling points, but it has flaws as well. As a content creator, I always felt it was one of my responsibilities to alert you to both. I'm not someone who tries to pass off every build I ever made as the best build ever. I'd rather transparently discuss what it is and isn't capable of, and then let you decide for yourself if it's something you'd like to try out. Starting out with the good, and I think the thing I like most about this build is that it's very easy to activate. I start every engagement in the exact same way. I get a fusion rifle kill on an easy target to proc Radiant for 13 seconds. I smash the ground in front of me with a healing grenade to get my restoration rolling. Then I pull out Tommies and I go to work. The extremely high damage output knocks out most red bars in the blink of an eye. And even healthier major tier enemies, it can focus them down very efficiently. I mean, if you need ad clearing, Tommy's got ya. And thanks to our 2x restoration, the self damage is pretty much a non-factor, and you can shrug off a lot of incoming damage at the same time. You're not invincible, but it does take a lot to put you down in most content. So as long as you can keep your murder spree going, you have very little to worry about. And then provided you don't have an artifact champion mod assigned to auto rifles, you can double cover champion types with this setup. Tommy's, with its ability to self-generate ignitions, can cover unstoppables, and having the Radiant buff active allows you to break barrier champion shields with your weapons. It's always nice being able to double dip when the situation presents itself. Onto some drawbacks now. This build really thrives in ad heavy encounters. Not so much when things are a little more spaced out. I mean, it works, it just doesn't feel quite as impressive if there aren't enemies littering the field. And I did design this build with solo play in mind because that's how I engage with most of the content in Destiny 2. Teammates definitely could steal kills out from underneath you, causing your Radiant or Restoration effects to expire. Then, Ember of Mercy and the Fire Sprites. I mentioned earlier how collecting one can refresh your 2x Restoration. But refresh is the key word. With multiple kills, you can get that restoration timer built up to 12 seconds. Collecting a Fire Sprite will always refresh it to 6 seconds. So they can be a benefit if you can snag one when your timer's running low, but they can also be a detriment if you accidentally collect one when your timer's up over 6 seconds. So I'd suggest kind of feeling out and seeing if Ember of Mercy is a fragment that you'd want to run. If you don't mind being a little more careful around the Fire Sprites, it can help. But if it's just not something that you want to worry about, I'd say probably replace the fragment with Ember of Ashes. Also, the focal point of the build is not boss damage. Tommy's, while it is doing great damage for a primary weapon, is not something that you're going to want to tackle most bosses with. I mean, it doesn't leave you completely SOL, you're just going to have to bring a decent legendary heavy weapon to lean on in that respect. Lastly, the build does have its limits as far as content difficulty. Raids, dungeons, gambits, seasonal activities, strikes, I mean, this build holds up fine in those activities. Legend tier or higher, things get a little shaky. Enemies that can deliver high burst damage can bang you right through that 2x restoration. So you might need to play a little more careful, a little more cautious, a little further back. And none of those things align with what this build wants to do. Now, I'm sure if you really wanted to, you could probably make it work. But there are plenty of other setups out there that suit that tier of content better than this does. But I definitely would recommend giving this build a try if you're remotely interested in what's going on here. Placing the right pieces around it took Tommy's from a weapon that I wouldn't even consider using, to a gun that I am thoroughly enjoying and just can't get enough of. But if you did enjoy the video and you'd like to support the content and the channel, like, subscribe, share, you know the drill, it's YouTube, but all those things really do help, and I do greatly appreciate it. But with all that being said, thank you for taking the time out of your day to check out this video. You guys are awesome, and I will catch you on the next one.